Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our workshop in the mock subordination and discrimination in the global supply chains, recognizing diversity and building unity. It is a blended learning interdisciplinary online course on diversity platform. Our labor expert and also course instructor today, Dr. Alessandra Mezzadri from SOAS, University of London. We will talk about social reproduction in global supply chains when life reinforces exploitation. My name is Hiền Dong. I am an online tutor at the Global Labor University Online Academy, and this workshop is a discussion further from Alexandra's lecture with the same topic in chapter 2 of our MOOC. I would like everybody to know that the workshop will be recorded, and please keep the camera on if you don't have any problem with that. Otherwise, you can turn the camera off. We will really appreciate if you could introduce yourself in the task box, where you come from, who you are, which field of work you are working on, so our guest speaker could understand the audience better. And in this 1 hour workshop, we will listen to Alexandra's introductory remarks, and then we will have two main questions and follow up with will be the last will be the questions for everybody in the last 10-15 minutes. But during the workshop, please raise questions or put the question on the chat box if you have any. But firstly, let me introduce our course instructor, Dr. Alessandra Mezzadri from University of London. She's a reader in global development and political economy. You can meet her not only in this MOOC, but also at the book academic advising, and in many books that she's the editors or co-writers or writers, such as The Switch-Off Regime, Marx in the Field, Handbook of Research on the Global Political Economy of Work is forthcoming. So, Alexandra, thank you very much for being with us today. Could you please give us a brief introductory remark on the video lectures in the MOOC? Over to you, Alexandra.
Thanks a lot, Hian, for the kind introduction and for inviting me to be here with you all. And greetings to everyone. It's wonderful to see that we come from many different places. And thanks everyone for being here. If this was a longer workshop, probably I would want to have all of us introduce ourselves, but just time is of the essence. So what I'll do in these few minutes is try to recap some of the points that I made in the video. They focused on intersectional oppression in global supply chains and how it relates to exploitation, and how social reproduction realms, and we will see what I mean by it, actually reinforce this process of exploitation. Now, I have to first say a little bit on who I am. I think it's just very useful to start from that to understand why I just came out with these insights on what I think what I think are key processes that structure exploitation in global supply chains. I study and research sweatshops, particularly in India, although I've done work elsewhere. So focus mostly on textile and garment, both in factories as well as in smaller workshops and in home-based realms of work. So I've done this work for around 15 to 18 years. So in a sense, the short video that you saw, it's a reflection on how we can study labor conditions in sweatshops. So when I was doing my research, I would enter a place and try to grapple with how we can understand the type of working conditions and labor standards of the workforce. And I soon realized that while the assembly line or the factory or the space of work give us some insights into what goes on in the working lives of people, then effectively to fully understand why people experience work in the way they did, we had to expand the perimeters of the labor process. So as labor scholars or labor activists, we focus on the space of work. But for instance, focusing only on the space of work, you only understand very partially why, for instance, in a factory, you might have people sitting next to each other and all earning a different wage while doing the same job, and all being exposed to different type of contractual or working conditions. So what is it that explains this diversity? And of course, the first thing that explains this diversity is the social identity of the workers in question. So this is how we need to understand identity, not as secondary to the experience of work, but central to the experience of work. I generally use this expression. So people walk and arrive at the factory gate already with a price tag attached to their body. So the exploitation they will experience doesn't start in the factory. Its initial aspects are actually already made before they arrive at the factory gate. Now, these features that will then impact on the working conditions and so on their exploitation, of course, have to do with sex, have to do with gender, the two not being exactly the same, has to do with ethnicity or processes of racialization depending on context. If we're talking about, for instance, a multi-ethnic context versus instead a settler colonial context, where we generally refer instead to race more than ethnicity. And of course, it deals with mobility. If people come from distant locations, if this mobility is internal, international, and so on. All of these little facets of individual identities are instrumentalized inside the factory to segment the labor force, and this concretely impacts exploitation. First of all, the most obvious way is on the wage, because people might receive a different salary. And then, of course, in the type of contracts that we see are given to different workers, the different type of working conditions, the different types of benefits, and so on. So basically, already we see that to trace the real perimeters of the labor process, if we want to say something meaningful about how people experience exploitation and work in general, we cannot start from the space of work, but we need to start from before. We need to start with an understanding of all the intersectional, we say, structures of oppression that make workers differ. So a community of workers might be highly diversified. So for instance, if I had to make an example from the some of the factories that I surveyed in the north of India, you would have that migrants from the states like Uttar Pradesh or Bihar, which are traditionally very poor states, of course, will be more discriminated against in terms of salaries and contractual conditions, as opposed instead local workers from around the region. And women within this grid would be more than discriminated against, again, not just on the basis of migration only, but also on their gender and so on. So there is a process of intersection between the various facets of the identity. So this is the first point. So exploitation is experienced differently by different people. So it comes in varied forms. And this we need to pay a lot of attention to when it comes then to issues of organizing as well. And of course, this opens up to a number of tricky discussions to be had in terms of how you go about mobilizing a labor force which is greatly diverse. Now, this is the first point. The second point of the video is that not only social identity is central to exploitation, but also the centrality of non-work spaces, or better, life spaces. When we talk about social reproduction spaces, this is in short what we mean, where we make life, not make work, right? So in life making spaces, we have also other issues to look at, which have key repercussions of how we analyze exploitation. People in factories make things, make various things. And of course, in a farm, again, you would make other things. But actually, already in life spaces, the home, the village, the community is where we actually make labor, right? So that labor that arrives at the factory gate, so differentiated, does so because it's first of all made or regenerated in a number of life-based realms. Now, if you look at the organization of global supply chains in the global economy today, you can see that these life spaces, again, as they already the social identity of workers, are utilized for the purpose of expanding the possibility of exploitation. Now, this process happens because employers are able to use a number of devices to anchor the life of workers beyond the labor time to the process of exploitation. Now, how does this happen? It happens, I propose in the video in 3 ways, but I'm sure you can identify others. The first way is through where is it that generally classic global supply chain workers live. This is generally in dormitories around industrial areas. It is in industrial hamlets. It depends on the country we look at. We have different type of infrastructural solution, but generally they are very close to the factories. And also there are interlinkages between the people that run these spaces, which are the life spaces of workers, and the factories. And again, there are different possibilities or solutions, but you can have labor contractors, gang masters, you can have employers directly having a dormitory, you can have state promoted dormitories, and so on and so forth. But there are always linkages. And through these linkages, you see that workers can be controlled also outside the factory time and the factory space. This connection between where workers live and where they work is key to expand the possibility for exploitation, because basically you can always recall the worker on the assembly line, or even by the fact that you might live in a dormitory which is owned by your employer, of course, you will turn into a more compliant worker. So this is the first way. The second way is through migration. And through migration of what is generally in global supply chain a highly mobile labor force. So what happens is every time that the workers go back to the place of origin, the employer is able not to pay generally their cost for sustenance. So in a sense, for highly precarious workers, this process whereby they return home and then back to the factories is a process that allows employers in supply chains to cut costs. Because whenever they leave, of course, that will work as a sort of subsidy, right, for employers. And this we see that in garment, textile, shoewear, electronics, it works for specific periods of the year, which are the lean season of sectoral production. So it's like going back to your village might work as a sort of subsidy to your employer that doesn't have to worry for you or sustain your costs.
I haven't do that is our accept.
Now, the third way in which I suggest the social reproduction realms or better life realm matter in supply chains is the fact that if we look at the very vast number of supply chain productions, again, I'll repeat myself, but textile, garment, shoewear, electronics, toys, and then, of course, if we look at globalized agriculture, we'll have fish, we will have flowers, we will have an extraordinary number of commodities to add to classic tropical commodities, which are organized in this way for a very long time: coffee, sugar, cocoa, and so on and so forth. If you look at the organization of these chains, you will see that, sorry, I just have a problem with my audio.
We can hear you well.
Okay.
Yes.
So where was I? Okay, I got my trail of thoughts got lost. Basically, if you look at all these commodity chains, you would see that some of the issues that I raised actually resonate with the type of labor trends that you will have there. Now, what does this mean? Oh, sorry, no, I was talking about home workers. Yeah, the third channel, sorry. So if you look at these chains, you would see that the great decomposition of the labor process in all these chains that I talked about imply that you have at the lower rungs the possibility for a lot of household production to be incorporated. And there you have a full overlap between life spaces and production spaces. So the embroiderer in garment making, the thread cutter in textile production, the chip maker for electronics, the sole maker for shoewear, the packer for certain forms of agriculture. All these small tasks can be decentralized to the home-based realm of production. So these are the three ways in which you see the process, so the realms of social reproduction shaping exploitation in global supply chains. I'll stop here because I think that is enough as an intro that spoke to the video. But of course, what I think we should be really interested here in this session is what does it mean for the way in which we can then focus on organizing and mobilizing a workforce which is exposed to this type of pressures.
Thank you very much, Alessandra. I believe that the introductory remarks shed light on the video lectures and also make a lot of clarification for our course participants. But it's chance for everybody to ask questions. The floor is open, and also the chat box is also waiting for questions from you. In the course, Dr. Alessandra, because in the under the video lectures, there's a lot of discussions and everybody. Yes, so we have a question from Femil. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I really appreciate the doctor for a brief also. It's really a topic of interesting because I would say I experienced something like this some years back when I started work with this Chinese company, CCCC in Nigeria. I realized that there are people that I even do lesser work than I do, but they are paid higher than I receive. So I do wonder. And anytime you complain, they will just find one way or the other. In short, they may say, if you are not satisfied, you can go. And this is the same Nigeria. Even those that doesn't have the qualification that you have, they are receiving higher than you do. How do they rate them? I do wonder, how does this happen? Why is it happening in short way? And then many, to be sincere, it's still happening up to today, as far as we are concerned in Africa. And this is another one of the challenges then when I was a union in the union as the secretary, general secretary of my mother union there. So we do hopes that what is happening is only happening here. Then we don't know that it's happening all over the world. So when we see it like this, we look at it, no, you just come here, no, it's not. So how to ask, what are the Global Labour Union or Global Labour University and International Labour Organization, what are they really doing to make sure that this doesn't continue? Because it's a problem that continues existing. And it also comes in terms of casualization in some establishments. I could remember when I was working with electricity company, transmission company of Nigeria, I realized that the casual staff, they do, in short, more work more than the main staff. But they are receiving meager without any compensation in any way. And many of them has been a casual for years, where there's nothing to show for it. Why the so-called staff that they do little or nothing, in most cases, are the one that is reaping their benefits? So I want to know what is the International Labour Organization really doing to make sure that this doesn't continue for long? I believe if a company wants to hire, a candidate would have passed through an interview and so many other processes. If it's not qualified, there's no need of hiring. Not to subject to the, okay, you under probation for many period, maybe initially, maybe for 1 month, before you know it turn to 3 months, turn to a year, and so on and so forth. Please, I want to know, what are they really doing in the International Labour Organization?
Thank you, Femir. Yeah, thank you for the question. Alexandra, would you like to go ahead with answering these questions?
I have to say that I would leave the question of what the Global Labour University is doing to the Global Labour University staff. I can tell you what I have been witnessing in terms of my own engagement with garment workers' unions in South Asia, and what are some of the challenges and traps that they have encountered, and what have been solutions taken by some that instead can address that. So yes, I think the issue of differential payments and differential contractual position is very widespread. And of course, it's not just utilized to cut costs, but it's mainly utilized, in fact, to divide the labor force. So, for instance, we did a study on the wages of permanent workers in the garment industry in North India and the wages of contractual workers, so non-permanent seasonal workers. And we found that wages in some cases were showing big differentials, but in some cases they were not even showing differentials at all. So the purpose is more to differentiate or fragment the labor force within a factory so that you have, as a result, a disciplining effect on everyone, both permanent as well as contractual laborers. So cost minimization is not the only reason why this can happen. Now, we had different type of union response, and I think some, from where I'm standing, are more useful than others. There are some union that adopted a very vanguardist position to focus on the workers that have a larger structural power, which would be the permanent workers first, and then try to expand to contractual workers only when they could. And instead, there were those unions, which in my view are the most progressive, and they managed to have a better impact, that they try to reach out to all different type of workers and also organized focus groups and the spaces where workers could exchange their own experience. In many cases, workers don't even know that the person sitting next to them might be paid differently from them, only after some engagement they might know. But for instance, especially if the contract workers you work alongside is likely to change a lot, that people they might not even realize, and it's really hard to form a community. So I think the first one of the most successful efforts towards unionization, that is by in South India, actually North India, by a local union called GATU, the Garment Workers Trade Union, managed to sort of get all the workers together and creating groups whereby you had a mix between permanent workers and contract workers coming together, especially in a context whereby in the last 10 years, this industrial area moved from having mostly local workers, or anyway, workers coming from nearby places, to instead having a significant component of long-term migrants. So the first issue you have is trying not to turn workers against each other. And this is something that the unions have to be very wary of, because in highly precarious sectors, what can be the sort of one of the classic traps they might follow into is to only focus on the better off workers. And then that becomes very problematic, because you alienate a significant part of the most precarious and informalized sort of segment of the workforce. But of course, I mean, I can only speak to what has been the experience from South Asia, or what have been more successful strategies. But then, of course, there'll be challenges that also are very local based and based on the sector that we're looking at.
Thank you, Alessandra. Also, thank you, Fermin, for the questions. Rak below, please go ahead with the question. But keep the question short, please, to give space for others as well. Thank you.
I just want to speak from the angle of Mr. Femi. The rate of unemployment is very high in the global south here, especially in Nigeria. That's why, irrespective of the condition they gave you as a workers, you just have to abide it, but because there's no job. To tell you is either you accept it or you leave. So what is the major issue is that our the two labor center, they need to upgrade. I mean, the NSC, the Nigeria Labour Congress, and the Trade Union Congress, to make sure that all this convention has been rectified, and most of our labor laws are obsolete. As in, I mean, the fine they gave those organizations, they need to upgrade it. Thank you.
Thank you, Milo, and also Femil. Any other questions from the audience? Maybe I come to statement or my observation from all the discussion that's going on under the video lecture, Alessandra, because this really, the video lecture is really thought-provoking, and our course participants has found out a lot of facts from their respective countries. I can give here some examples. Migrant as a channel for social reproduction, co-producing exploitation, which happens a lot in the Philippines. The common term of for the work arrangement with no work, no pay arrangement is contractual employments. They get low financial and employee benefit support from the employers, and are also discriminated in a number of ways. Besides exploiting their work capacity, they may also be abused emotionally. That's the case of Philippines. Or most women in Nigeria are best considered for unprofessional routine work like janitors, secretaries, and caregiving service. It is believed that women are designed to do such work, hence the undue discrimination they face. In Sri Lanka, discrimination, transnational labor exploitation also popular. Here, women with low income often go abroad as housekeeper, and they are broker for this, and found themselves in desperate situations, but no investigation is done by the government or semi-government agencies. Due to this, not only those women but also their families are put under severe discomfort and mental and physical pressures. Their children are also suffering from severe difficulties and various problems. Same situation was shared by other participants from Indonesia, from Nepal, from Bangladesh, India. I also believe we have a lot of participants from this workshop also say, have observed the same situations. So what's your observation and thought about this?
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Well, this, I think, speaks to both the issues which are raised in the short video. So on the one hand, you see how with all the cases that you're mentioning, you do have gender and mobility interplaying in specific ways to reinforce the way in which women in this case actually experience exploitation in global supply chains. And also all the examples that I gave so far of global supply chains made reference to supply chains where we make commodities, so where we make things, while a significant share of global supply chains are those where people are moved and not so much commodities are moved, like, for instance, is the case for what are known as global care chains, which your questions actually refer to quite significantly. So you have women picking up care jobs or domestic work jobs in this chain in different domains. So you have transnational supply chains, which have the structure proper of global supply chains, where you have international migrants. And of course, the Philippines, I know, is a massive sending state, not just in the West, but particularly in the Gulf. I think they are the first, together with Sri Lankan and now Ethiopian workers, the first ethnicities that are sought as carers or nannies or domestic workers in the Gulf being a very special geographical space because they insource 80% of all their labor, which is extraordinary, right? And of course, you have a lot of instances of abuse. This is, if you look at the structuring of global care chains, they really speak about the ways in which gender, mobility, status interplay. And you see that exploitation is obtained because of the nationality of these women, because of the type of organization of the chains, where you have contract agents that withhold the passports of the workers. So there is also an embeddedness with state practice, which is significant. So sending states know this, and the receiving states know this, and they all participate. So this presents specific challenges legally. And you also have race or ethnicity as a discriminatory factor. So, for instance, I have a student that is now working in the Gulf on chains and in what is known as the kafala system. And what she's her finding indicates that all these women are priced and paid differently based on the country of provenance. So that a carer, say, from the Philippines is more expensive than a carer from Ethiopia, or definitely a carer from Sri Lanka. And there are different stereotypes about these nationalities that are used to explain why a certain group is supposed to be more valuable than another group. So again, there's a great degree of fragmentation and segmentation of the labor force, which again means that based on social profile, people experience exploitation differently. So thanks for the question.
Thanks a lot, Alessandra. Any other questions from the audience? Benjamin, please take the floor.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Thank you. So my question is, I think social reproduction is a useful concept. For example, in the Philippines, I come from the Philippines. I mean, across the economy, of course, gender is a factor in occupational segregation. So, for example, domestic workers would mostly be, overwhelmingly will be women, and then migrants from the provinces. However, when I look at one particular workplace and for example, garments or electronics and global supply chains, I don't think we see differentiation in terms of wages and conditions between male and female, locals or migrant workers. So my question is, would you care to comment? Am I missing something on using social reproduction as a lens in looking at this? Like, for example, in just particular workplaces, it seems gender or ethnicity is not much of a factor.
Well, of course, thanks for the question, Benjamin. Of course, you're very right that concretely, while you can have all these factors at play to differentiate exploitation for the workforce, in some places you mobilize more some differences than others. So, for instance, when you have highly patriarchal societies, you would have the gendered wage differentials are very significant. Now, I'm not familiar with the case of Philippines. I'll actually go and explore it after this session. But in the place where I'm from, which is Italy, still we have a 30% wage gap between men and women, even in the service sector, which is quite extraordinary. And I'd say that you observe similar trends in other parts of the Mediterranean and certainly in Eastern Europe, while you have less so in Western Europe. Then in the countries that I researched, because this would be India, Pakistan, or Bangladesh, then here you do find a very significant difference between women's labor and men's labor when it comes to wages in garment. Now, it might well be that in the Philippines, there is no wage differentials as such, but then in my mind, before accepting that there is no gender discrimination, I will have a number of questions in my head. So what happens to women when they get pregnant? Do they have maternity entitlements? Are they given like a healthcare leave? Are they able to go back to their jobs once they finish the maternity period? What I'm saying is wages are a way to discriminate between the sexes, but there's not the only way, right? And to give you a sense, post-COVID, even in the UK, which is supposed to be, after Scandinavia, in Europe, the country with the least level of gender discrepancy in wages, we have seen that 80% of women's furlough applications during the pandemic were rejected. So this is effectively a state that is telling women, even women that have gained a lot in the last century, that when the crisis hit, you still need to stay at home. So it's, and instead the male partner has to work. So when we look at gender discrimination, I think wages, but also other things might be at play.
Thank you, Alessandra, also Benjamin, for the question and the answer. Edlira, please go ahead with the question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alessandra, for this very interesting discussion. I don't know how to put exactly the question, but you made reference to these identities that people have and how they actually intensify exploitation. And I wanted to get your thoughts on how do you have a discussion on organizing these workers by incorporating these different identities without falling into identity politics. Because I think we've seen in a number of cases and personal stories that I know that sometimes we hear class completely removed from the organizing because some sort of a prevailing of, you know, a particular form of discrimination, whether that's gender or race and so on. So I just want to know, how do you engage with this question? Thank you.
Well, I think this is one of the key questions for today's organizing in whichever form. And I think, of course, class has to remain central to concerns of organizing. But the thing is, how do you make people feel that they belong to the same class, and how you nurture a process of working class formation so that people then feel that the union or the organizing institution is a place that is welcoming of all the differences, but also that it speaks to the very different ways in which we experience work and we face challenges in regard to our exploitation. So in global supply chains, it's exactly the same thing. So in a sense, the question is really for, and in each context, which are the actions by unions that will facilitate a process of amplification of working class consciousness, which on the one hand is able to build this common identity among workers, but at the same time that recognize that there are these differences, and the union needs also to have initiatives that target those that are the most vulnerable workers within supply chains. So I think within the same organizing collective, there might be a union, a movement, an institution, there can be space and time for both strategies. So you would fight, for instance, campaigns around the living wage for everyone, where, of course, the issue of class will be sort of presented as the most compelling, and where equality comes in the non-discrimination principle that everybody has to be paid the same. But on other issues, you need to also push for targeting specific concerns, which might not be everyone's concern. So for instance, in global supply chains, we know by now, from evidence from textile and garment, but increasingly from global agriculture, evidence from cocoa, from flower cuttings, that sexual harassment is utilized against women workers as a tool for labor control. Now, unions, they might not be women-only unions, need to focus on this as a specific concern, which everybody has to recognize as a union concern, but of course they will target and try to ameliorate the lives of women first and foremost. So in a sense, and the same goes with ethnicity. So for instance, if you explore well, in global supply chains, if you look at, for instance, South Asian productions, you would know that Dalit workers are always placed at the very bottom of supply chains, as you would know that if you look at the Southern Cones, South Africa, Black South African laborers is paid more than Zimbabwean labor that crosses from nearby countries. These are all forms of discrimination that we know very well. So unions at that level need to be able to speak of issues of racial discriminations while at the same time build this common identity. So I think it's a balancing act that starts with getting your workers together and trying to strategize around ways where you can build the class consciousness that recognize the common experience, but is also respectful of the differences in which instead the experience manifests.
Thanks a lot, Elira and Alexandra, for very interesting question, and also in the overviews of the situation. We have some thoughts in the chat box from Sajib Day. In Bangladesh, mainstream workers, for example, IMG transport worker, have faced challenges in the collective bargaining. Thus, they have limited scope for supply chains worker in there to enjoy their even basic rights here. So there's a lack of so basic rights is not represented here, and also not really respected here. Thanks Sharif Day for sharing this. Benjamin also said there is around 25% gender pay gap in the Philippines, but it is said to be due to the occupational segregation. And Mabisi Bashi also said that how can his question is, how can this problem of labor broker be stopped? Maybe you go for that, Alexandra.
Thanks a lot for really terrific questions. I'm not sure I can give justice to all. Well, I don't know enough about the Bangladeshi case that you referred to. So from your question, it seems that there were attempts at collective bargaining between, they were intersectoral, right? So ready-made garment and transport workers together. Well, I think this type of bargaining has specific challenges. So you have that transport workers and ready-made garments really belong to different planets, to be honest, at least in terms of structural power. So again, what you can do is build alliances on some very basic common campaigns or issues. And again, pay is a no-brainer, because living wages will allow you for broad coalitions that then embolden and actually inspire the labor movement as a whole. But then, to be honest, you have to recognize that collective bargaining is not like a magic wand. So people in the garment sector have very different needs from people in transport. So of course, you were talking about extremely different labor processes. You're talking about very different labor conditions. You're talking about different challenges. So I think then you have to focus on collective bargaining, which is intersectoral, on the issues where you can identify how you build the momentum and you have a broad platforms of people that can be placed together strategically for a key aim. But then you'll have to disaggregate and deal with sectors separately, at least in this case, because these seem to be two sectors entirely different to me. On the 25% gender pay gap, so we do have a gap. Well, I find it interesting, the debate around what is due to discrimination per se and what is occupational sex segregation, but in a sense it's like we're renaming the beast in a different way, because even if you accept that women are paid less because they're overrepresented in certain sectors, then it should follow that those sectors where women are which are overcrowded with women, then should have instead a significant uplifting of the wage. And why does this not happen? So in a sense, it's still like the same type of argument we're looking at. You don't need to have people performing the same task for the argument about pay equality to be put forward. I mean, we can make this argument on different grounds, I think. But of course, you will have that the challenges organizationally and legally, I would say, if you want to target the state and the legislator as well, are different from different countries, and because gender inequality manifests very differently across the world economy. Now, the labor brokers' problems, how can it be stopped? Well, this is the million-dollar questions, but I worked a lot on labor brokers, and of course I left as any sort of white Western woman with the idea that labor brokers are the worst thing ever. And I landed in rural India where I stayed over a year. And to be honest, it's very true that labor brokers are quite a tricky category because, of course, the fact that you have a lot of them means that they take a cut on the wages of the workers, but he also speaks to specific challenges that workers, especially at the most vulnerable rungs of supply chains, face. So, for instance, I give you an example. Where we were trying to study the relations between labor contractors and the home-based workers in garment and textile, we asked the workers, why would you work for the labor contractors? Or like, would you still work for the labor contractor if the employer employed you directly? And their answer was no. And it was no because the broker advanced the wages of the workers. So some of the embeddedness of middlemanship in the global supply chain domain is due to the fact the workers not only need a wage, but they need a credit advance. So the labor contractor is not just a middleman, but it's at once the mediator of employment and the bank of the worker, in contexts where you have that informal workers do not have access to formal channels of credit. And otherwise, they would go to the money lender. So generally, the advance is at interest zero, at least in the context I study. So I don't want to defend labor brokers at all, because in an ideal world, that would not exist. But we need to ask ourselves the question, why is this category so resilient? Because we want our policy implications to be meaningful, not just to be utopian, and to say, labor brokers should not exist. In an ideal world, they should not exist, but they cover a very specific role. So how can unions deal with credit issues that the most vulnerable categories of workers face so that the labor broker become less fundamental in their life? This is the right question to ask. And for instance, if you look at some organization of informal workers, they have asked themselves this question early on. The Self-Employed Women Association, which everybody generally refers to as the best practice of informal workers union, very few people know that they started off as a cooperative bank. And the reason why they started off as a cooperative bank back in the 70s, because they came out of a split from the Textile Workers Association in 76 in India, is exactly because they realized that the first thing that women needed, and the reason why they were so exploited, was the fact that they were in structural debt. And this made them particularly exposed to exploitation by the employer. So the provision of credit by SEVA was central to their possibility then to organize these women. Now, I'm not saying this is, of course, something that can be generalized, but I think in each location and in each sector, in each global supply chain, where we do find so many brokers, we need to ask, why are they there? And why is it so difficult to get rid of them? And by addressing this question, maybe we can come up with the ideas on how to think the global supply chain otherwise.
Thank you. Edlira, please go ahead.
Yeah, when the question of the labor brokers was first raised, what came to my mind was an experience in the construction sector, though, in South Korea, where you had rampant, labor brokering and subcontracting and terrible conditions of workers in the construction sector. And then the policy intervention was to make the principal employer responsible for accidents at work. And that kind of led to certain arrangements that limited the power of the labor brokers, if not removing them, because all of a sudden, I mean, one main reason why these intermediaries are put there is to remove the responsibility of the principal employer, whether that's in terms of wages or social security or whatever is from the principal employer. But I understand, I think it's very interesting the point you are making, Alessandra, about the role of these labor brokers in certain contexts, but that also raises the question how then these workers become completely dependent on these labor brokers because of the debt. So in a way, it may seem as some sort of a solution, which is not. It just creates another level of dependency and over-exploitation. It may. So in a way, it's not that it is impossible to do away with the labor brokers, and there are policy initiatives that can be put in place, and there are things that the trade unions can do, and I think the example of SEVA is very informative in that sense. But yeah, thank you. Very interesting discussion.
Thank you, Elira. The floor is now open for any other, well, so the last round of questions and thoughts and sharing. Ratmas, would you like to pose the question directly? Otherwise, I can also help you. Can you kindly explore the motive behind the use of third parties by multinational organizations in recruitment? We have this situation in Zimbabwe. It's now the model whereby large number of employees in the labor are recruited through third parties. So, Alessandra, yes.
Yes, indeed, this is something which is increasingly becoming a key functioning mechanism in, well, not just global supply chains, but I guess everywhere. It's just they have a different names. We call them labor contractors. In supply chains, which are more labor intensive, we call them manhunt or agency in higher service, but it's something which we have seen everywhere. I think actually Lira's previous comment answers this pretty much, in the sense that the whole idea behind labor contracting is to create a fracture between the employer and the employee, so the capital and labor, if you want, depending on which language you want to use. So you create an interface that makes sure that the employment relation is somehow hidden or more difficult to be reconstructed. We sometimes refer to this as triangle employment relation, so that you have this person in the middle that sort of divorces the two main parties in the process. So you have it for multinational organization, you have it for many other organizations. The objective is always to minimize the responsibility towards the workforce. I think by now we have it very clear, because there have been many studies, and you know, of course I like to refer to my own evidence because I stand on more stable ground, but there are like a lot of secondary studies also in higher up segments of production that highlight that there are hardly any wage benefits, right? Because you still need to pay quite substantial amount if it's capital intensive supply chains, and if it's a labor intensive supply chain, you have wages that are already so close to the cost of subsistence that you cannot go under that, because otherwise you will not recruit anyone. So cost is really not what is at essence here. The labor recruiter interface covers functions of labor control and labor disciplining and sort of disguising, if you want, the wage relations, and make it more difficult for employees and for labor in general to actually place complaints, for instance. And we have seen this in last project I was involved with the ILO was an attempt to map workers' grievances in the garment sectors in India and different locations. And one of the issues that workers faced, particularly in the north, was that how tricky it was to file a legal complaint where you're not directly employed. So it takes at least legally 2 extra steps that what being directly employed would do. So that creates a lag, which both the employers and the state, which knows this all too well, actually can benefit from to slow the process whereby a workers can file through the union or by themselves for either compensation or to place a grievance in relation to other types of issues.